Good morning. Good to be here this morning. As Brian mentioned, we've known each other since the early 90s when I was preaching in St. Louis, and we think the world of Yvonne. We love them both dearly. Our kids got to spend some good years growing up with their kids, and that was a special blessing as well. Glad to be back. I was here in 2008, and we had an opportunity to look at some lessons that dealt with how to be the kind of husband, the kind of wife, what God expects out of us as a husband and as a wife, and some things of that nature, and how to resolve conflict and things of that type that were dealing mostly with the very practical side of marriage. What we're going to be doing in the next few days, if the Lord permits us to do so, is to look at 3 lessons today that all deal with the marriage side of the equation, but looking at some very basic and yet I think critically important principles in the lesson this morning, as well as the third session this morning. And in the one in between, we're going to be looking at the marriage, but in particular as to how children affect the marriage relationship itself. Then Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday are all 3 lessons dealing with the other side of the equation, the parenting side of the equation. And what do we do to raise our children the way that God would have us to raise them so that they will be the kinds of people that God expects them to be? So as we think about that, I want you to look at a quote I'm about to project here. There have been a lot of things written about the concept of marriage and family by a lot of different people, some that are faith-based and some that are not. But I've always liked this particular statement that is by Confucius, and he just says, to put the world right in order, we must first put the nation in order. To put the nation in order, we must first put the family in order. To put the family in order, we must first cultivate our personal life. We must first set our hearts right. And so this lesson is entitled Finding God in Your Marriage, and I hope you'll see why that is in a moment. But I would agree with that statement that I can only really affect one small area in this world, and first that has to be me. So if I'm going to have the kind of marriage that I should have, if I'm going to have the kind of family that I should have, if I'm going to be the kind of parent that I should be, then I need to be the man that God expects me to be. That's what I can change. I can become who God wants me to be if that's what I choose to do, if that's where I choose to put my effort forth. My wife has the responsibility of becoming the woman that God expects her to be. If she does that and I do what I'm supposed to do, then God will help us to be the husband and the wife we need to be, the parents that we need to be. We have to affect ourselves first. And so we want to look at some principles, I think, that are very basic to understanding what it is God wants us to be. And there's a reason behind that. The passage that was just read to us out of Ephesians 5, we'll go back to that in a few moments, but I would tell you that is critical to understanding a very basic principle about who it is we're supposed to be. I was not raised in a home that was influenced by Christ at all. Matter of fact, I was raised in a home that would have been probably the exact opposite of that picture, if you can imagine that. And I had the blessing from God, and in, I believe, His providence. He put somebody into my life when I was in high school and early years in college that helped me to see a different picture of life and how Jesus Christ could influence that. And he was raised in a family that was godly, in a family that behaved the way God would expect a family to behave, and that made a big difference to me. And that's why I am so, in my life at least, so focused on spending a lot of time dealing with marriage and family issues. And I will explain the conclusion of that thought as we get to the end of the lesson. I told you I like that one quote. I like this one, probably not for the same reason, but by all means marry. If you get a good wife, you'll become happy. If you get a bad one, you'll become a philosopher. So I think that's probably giving us a little indication as to what he thought of his married life. But I read a book on marriage that had this quote in it by Gary and Betsy Rakucci, and I liked this. It said, one of the best wedding gifts God gave you was a full-length mirror called your spouse. Had there been a card attached, it would have said, here's to helping you discover what you're really like. And so I thought in terms of this kind of a question. And I ask this, and you don't have to raise your hands. You're welcome to if you want, not asking for a verbal response. But how many of you learned something about your spouse after you got married that you didn't know before you got married? So all of us probably would nod yes or raise, just like, yeah, we did. But more importantly, how many of you learned something about yourself after you got married that you didn't realize before you got married? Because now you had somebody that you're living with 24/7 who is going to help you see things about yourself that you may not have recognized on your own. There's a book written by Gary Thomas called Sacred Marriage. And in the book, he describes getting an award when he was in school for most polite child. Do you remember those kind of awards? I don't know if they still do those or not, but when we were in school, most funny, most likely to succeed. I didn't get either one of those, but there were these different awards presented. He said, I got most polite child. He said, and I actually thought it was a pretty well-deserved award. He said, because I was raised to always say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and thank you, sir, and thank you, ma'am, and I opened the doors for people. He said, and so I thought I was that polite child that I got that award for. He says, until I got married. He says, and I remember asking my wife on one occasion, how much do you love me? She said, I love you with all my heart. With all my being, I love you. He said, I responded this way. I told her, I don't need that much. I only need 7 seconds. And she was baffled. She said, 7 seconds? He said, yes, I've timed it. That's how long it takes to refill the ice cube trays and put them back in the freezer. Now, I know there's a whole generation of people here that's lost on. Never, it didn't always come out the door, trust me. There used to be trays, first metal ones, then plastic ones. But he said, could I really have been that petty? He says, and I had to acknowledge, yes, I was. And so we find out some things about ourselves that really aren't what we would like to find out. And I think that's exactly what happens with God and with His Word. When God tells us in James that it is a mirror, in other words, sometimes I look in the Word of God, and sometimes I look and I think, oh, I like that. You know what? That just seems to fit. Fits my life, fits my way of thinking, whatever the case may be. But sometimes I look in and I think, ooh, there's a big smudge. He says, and you look in the mirror and you got a big smudge and you turn around, you don't do anything about it. He says, why'd you even look in the mirror? We want to look at the principles of God and see whether or not they show us things about ourselves that way. And so we're going to ask the question, what is marriage for? Because God said, when He created marriage, He said, it's not good that man be alone. So we know that there is a companionship associated with marriage that God intends to be fulfilled. And it's interesting when He said that He was make a helper suitable for Adam. That word that He uses, helper, in Hebrew is ezer, and it means that which is fit for. Almost as if you have the man here, the woman here, and they just fill each other's gaps in life. She supplies to him what he needs that he doesn't have on his own, and vice versa. They fit together. And that word is used most frequently not regarding the man-wife relationship, as it is there in Genesis. Most frequently, when that word shows up, it is used in reference to God and His relationship with us. God is our helper. In other words, He fulfills everything that is missing in our lives. And He says that about a husband and wife. What is it? So there is a companionship. We know that He told them to be fruitful and multiply, so He intends that children come out of a marriage relationship. That is the only proper way for children to come into a world is for married couples, and that's what God intended. He also tells us that the marriage bed is undefiled, so He intended that it be a place where He could allow us to fulfill in a righteous way the desires that he put into us, the drives that he put into us, so that we could enjoy that side of marriage relationship. There's a lot of things that we would say marriage accomplishes, but what is it for? In other words, what does God intend your marriage to accomplish? Not what does he intend to accomplish for you. What does God want your marriage to accomplish? Does that question make sense? Just like I tell the congregation back in Bulverde, just nod your head. I can read this. I can read this. I can't read this. So just nod your heads. What does he want marriage for? What's it for? Because we have wrong expectations so often. And in regards to marriage, that is certainly true. So much so that we have issues in our culture that have things like, people say soulmate. You ever heard that phrase? Finding your soulmate. And so people in our culture sever marriage thinking that their marriage didn't work because they didn't have the right person. But if they find the right person, then the marriage will work. That's a wrong expectation. God would tell us it isn't about finding the right person nearly as much as it is about being the right person. And so we get married with the wrong concept. And I think it's important for us to realize that happiness is not the goal of marriage. Don't get me wrong. God's not saying he doesn't want you to be happy. Happiness is not the goal of marriage. We get married thinking about the pictures we may have seen or the movies that we may have seen. One of the rom-coms where you've got people falling madly in love and living happily ever after, almost like he's the knight in shining armor swooping down on that white steed and throws her up onto the back and they ride off into the sunset. And we expect things out of marriage that God didn't necessarily intend marriage to be for us. So what does he intend marriage to be? I would tell you happiness is the byproduct or the result of a life that is properly lived. So if you turn back to Matthew chapter 5 in the Beatitudes, notice the way that is all phrased. Because God says, as Jesus is teaching, and he uses that word blessed, in other words, true happiness, true contentment in life, because that's not based on circumstances. We know that. Jesus is described as a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And yet when he prayed in John chapter 17, he prayed that his disciples might experience the joy that he had in this life. And he said, and my joy is full. So it's not the circumstances that determine whether I'm content or not, whether I'm happy, whether I'm fulfilled. And the Beatitudes would help us understand that, because it says, blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. As you continue down through those, think of the things that he says. And we'll get a chance to look at those individually, because I think there's a direct application to those concepts to us raising our children as well. And we'll look at that this week. But he says, if you think right, the idea of poor in spirit and mourning, and you think in terms of being the pure in heart and the hungering and thirsting after righteousness and being the meek and being the peacemakers, all of those things that he describes in there. He says, then life provides contentment. Happiness is not what we're striving for. It is the end game. And yet, we live in a country that has as a founding principle the very statement that says life, liberty, and most of us could all fill that in, could we not? The pursuit of happiness. If happiness is a pursuit, you will always fail. It is not a pursuit, it is a result of a pursuit. We need to make sure that we understand that. That is what we get. I think sometimes we even confuse that. People talk about their goal as a Christian. What's my goal? My goal is to go to heaven. I'm not sure that's the best way to phrase that. My goal is to live a life that is pleasing to God. If I do that, the result will be I go to heaven. Does that make sense? I think it's important that we put the goals where the goals need to be, and that's in the life that is lived, and we'll get the results that God talks about that we will get. So this series this week is not so much about how do I improve my marriage, how do I make my marriage easier, how is it that I can strive to become happier in my marriage. None of those things are the real questions that we're going to be answering. Here's what I want you to think about. What if God designed marriage to make us holy more than to make us happy? I know that's a strange concept. We don't normally think in those kind of terms, but what if that's what he intends my marriage to do? Not what does he intend me to get out of the marriage, the companionship and the children and the ability to have a relationship intimately with somebody. All of those are benefits I get in the marriage. But what's he want from Mark's marriage? What does he want from it? I would tell you, I think God definitely intends us to use our marriage to demonstrate holiness. And so if you'll think back to the passage in Ephesians chapter 5, or turn back there if you wish, that Landon read in our hearing just a moment ago, isn't it interesting that starting in verse 22 of that passage, Paul starts giving instructions regarding wives and what they're to do. In verse 25, husbands and what they're to do and how they're to do that and the motivation behind all of that on both of them. And he has this great dissertation here on marriage. And he gets to the end of that and he said, you realize I'm not really talking about marriage. That's not the point. I'm thinking, wait, you just spent all those verses talking about marriage. But he says that's not the point. And so in verse 31, when he says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two become one flesh, this mystery is profound, but I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Isn't it interesting that he says, your marriage points to Christ and the church and the relationship that Christ has with his church. And so people, when they look at your marriage, as with all life, but when they look at your marriage, they should see something that helps them understand God better than they do, that helps them stand in awe of the God that we serve. And I can tell you that the gentleman that brought me to Christ taught me for over 3 years. There's multiple reasons for that. Judy would be the first to tell you, because sometimes I'm a little on the stubborn side, so I just wasn't going to accept anything real fast. I was at that time of my life a confirmed agnostic. That's an oxymoron in itself. A confirmed I don't know, but I wanted empirical truth of either God or no God. And so I was looking for it that way. And that's not going to happen anyway. It's going to have to be evidentiary proof, and that's what God intended. But as I looked at them more, I told you I grew up in the home that was the exact opposite picture of Christianity. Highly abusive, alcohol-driven, in every respect, things that are just the picture of despair that exists because of that, all of that in the home. But then I'm being taught by this guy, and I'm looking at his home, and I thought, wow, his home's not like my home. I thought every home was like mine, because the family across the street from me, my good friend, his house was just like mine. And the kid that was down the street from me, who was my best friend at that time, his house was just like mine until his father was no longer in the picture and was gone. And so the two families I associated with the most of my life look like mine. So what's the natural assumption? That's family. That's just the way it functions. But then here's this family that was different. A husband and a wife, a mother and a father there, 2 children, 1 boy, 1 girl. They had relationships between the parents and between the parents and the children, and even between the siblings that was different than anything I'd ever seen. And so after almost 3 years of teaching, what really clicked for me was whatever they have in their life that is causing that is what I need in my life. And that was Jesus Christ. And so I started to realize that really their marriage is what pointed me to Jesus Christ, along with the things that he taught me. And I'm telling you, that I think is what God needs us to do. We need to have a marriage that points. And it's important to realize things like romance, like we think of it in this culture we're in, that's a relatively new pursuit. Think about Isaac. You remember Isaac meeting his wife? You know, she brought up and watering camels, and incredibly romantic scene as you think about that. And do you remember how God describes Rebecca? Said she was beautiful. You ever think about that? I mean, if God says she's beautiful, what she must look like, you know? And you think, well, yeah, no wonder he married her. She was gorgeous. When did he find out she was gorgeous? After they were married. She was veiled. He didn't see her face. She was veiled until he took her into the tent and he knew her as his wife. It wasn't based on romance. It was based on 2 people that they wanted to make sure were headed toward God. And I think that's what God wants us to understand. It isn't based on romance. So just quickly, and then I want to look at a couple of passages with you. No marriage can endure on romance and feelings alone. Why? Because feelings change. I'm not saying romance shouldn't be there. A good, godly marriage will have romance as well. It'll have people who are not only loving each other by doing what they need to for each other, but loving each other because they're madly in love with each other. We can accomplish all those things within a godly marriage. But you can't sustain it on romance and feelings because they change. We're not talking about children this morning, but I would tell you that's maybe the easiest place to realize that. We have 3 boys, all grown, they all married, they all have children of their own now. But as we're raising 3 boys, never was there a day in the whole time that we've had our children that I did not love my boys. But there were multiple occasions where I didn't like them very much. We were at odds with one another. We had disputes with one another. There were times where you thought, I brought you into this world, I can't take you out if I need to. We never really seriously contemplated that. But we understand that. Aren't there times that you like them and times that you're frustrated beyond belief? Same happens in marriage. I love my wife, but I assure you there are times that we've been frustrated with one another. Emotions aren't the driving force behind it. There has to be an elasticity to it. There has to be a stretch that is associated with it. The ability to bend. And that's what, because you love your children the way you do, because you love your spouse, it gives you the ability to bend and to flex and to work through issues that you have. And so if we're striving for happiness from our spouse, first off, if we're striving for happiness at all, we're striving for the wrong goal. But if we strive for happiness from our spouse, wrong goal, wrong source. Because nobody in this world can provide your happiness and contentment. Only God can provide that to you. That's important to remember. I'm not saying I'm not happy about things my wife does, but she's not the source. And so here's what we want to think about. Marital analogies teach us truths about God. It is incredible. There is a giant thread that runs through the scriptures. Just a giant thread that ties the concept of our relationship to God with a husband and wife relationship. Why do you think that is? That God would so frequently, not just Ephesians 5, but so frequently use that analogy to help us understand our relationship with Him. I think He does that because that's an analogy we can understand. And so God views His relationship with us the way a husband views his wife. Love the passage in Hosea chapter 2. Because God makes an interesting statement. He says, in that day, declares the Lord, in verse 16, you will call me my husband, not master. Now, I like that statement for a couple of reasons. One, I would ask you this. Did God cease on that day to become their master or be their master? No, he was still their master. He wasn't saying that, but he says, I need you to think of me in a different relational term. Because the word husband is going to carry an entire different thought process than the word master, would it not? And he says, I need you to understand, do we have a master relationship and servant relationship? Yes, we do. But we have a husband and wife relationship. And that should conjure up different ideas. Think about how he does that with the church and the way we relate to one another. It's interesting that the church, we will, even us ourselves, referring to ourselves, we will use the term that probably means the least of all the things that God chose when we're talking about ourselves. So we will talk about the church. Now, there's nothing wrong with that term. That's a good term. That whole idea of ecclesia, the called out. Only contextually can you even understand what it means, because Acts 19 uses the exact same word for an unruly mob of people. They were called out in the sense that they gathered together as this unruly mob. And so we talk about the church, and sometimes if we're not careful, we mix our metaphors so that we miss some of the point. And so we'll use a phrase like members of the church. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the phrase, but I would tell you it's not the proper use of the metaphor that God uses. He says members of the body, and there's a reason for that. In other words, I understand my arm is a member of my body, and when he describes the body, that's what he talks about, the way we are tied to one another. And my foot can't say to my arm or my head or any other part of my body, hey, I got no need of you. I'm going off on my own. He says a body's attached. It's a relational term. And he wants us to see that. He talks about us as a family, not just a church, but a family, the household of God. Those are relational terms. He does that so we can get different pictures, because the better we get the fulfilled picture and the full picture, the better we understand our relationship to him and to each other. Well, he does that with marriage and his relationship as well. So he says, no longer husband. No longer master, but husband. Or how about the way Isaiah phrases it in Isaiah 62? I love this one. Isaiah says in chapter 62 and verse 5, he says, as a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so will your God rejoice over you. Here's what I get a picture with that. I'm a visual guy, so I like pictures. I can remember the day we got married, almost 46 years ago for us. But I can remember the day because we got married in a building that would have been similar to this, just had one set of double doors in the back. But I can remember being up front, and the moment that Judy walked around the corner with her dad as they were going to come down the aisle, two things went through my mind. First, she was clutching his arm so tightly, I thought, I'm done. She's not leaving him. I'm done. But that only lasted for a moment, because I can remember the incredible joy of that moment. Can you remember that, men, when you saw your wife that day and saw her, whatever the arrangement was, but she's walking down the aisle, and you've got this incredible vision of beauty, and you're just so thrilled. He said, that's the way God looks at his people. Think about that husband and his wife and the relationship that they have. He said, God rejoices in his people the same way, the feeling that you had as a husband. So he's saying, I'm using these analogies to help us understand what it is that we're supposed to be doing, because marriage is a picture of divine reconciliation. Think of all the other things that God says. Think about all the other things that God says. Jesus himself is described as the bridegroom. That's our relationship with him. We understand that God used different stories like a wedding feast to help us understand that relationship. He uses phrases like the bride making herself ready in Revelation. Or when he talks on the flip side of that, more than once does he say of a generation of people that were choosing to turn their back on God, he addresses them as what? You adulterous generation, he says. Jeremiah the prophet did the same thing. It's throughout the Old Testament and the New. Not only when the marriage is working right does God have that relationship with his people. He says, when you stray from God, he said, that is adultery. You are married to God, but you are giving your allegiance to somebody else. How important is it that God uses that? It's not just wordplay. God uses these references to help us understand what the critical nature of our marriage is. How important it is that we be able to see that if I accomplish nothing else this week with you, that I could get you to understand when we walk out of this building today, or even while we're in here, God expects my marriage show to the world what kind of God he is and what kind of relationship he offers his people. And so if I don't live faithfully in my marriage the way that I should, what picture am I painting of my God to the world? Because that is important that we portray that. You remember David of old, King David, committing adultery with Bathsheba, conspiring to have her husband killed and then having him killed? All because he decided he wanted his happiness more than God needed him to do what was right. And Nathan the prophet went to David. And you remember what he said to him? Because David's going to lose his son that Bathsheba is now carrying. That boy's going to die. You remember why? God could have said, because what you did was horrendous. You committed adultery with her. You had no right to take her. The story that Nathan told him was all about that, wasn't it? You took this one guy's only ewe lamb that he had when you had everything in the world at your disposal. Could have said that. He could have said, then you tried to cover it up. You brought her husband home, hoping that he would go in and sleep with her and nobody would find out she was carrying your child. But he wouldn't do it because his men were at war and he refused to go in and have pleasure himself while his men were at war. So you sent him back to war. And you took the commander of your army, your trusted one, and sent him with a letter, or sent Uriah with a letter to give to the commander of the army so that he would draw back the forces and he'd be killed, and he was. And yet that's not what Nathan said. Nathan said, because you have given occasion to the enemies of God to blaspheme his name. And I don't want my marriage to blaspheme the name of God. Everything I tell my kids about God and reconciliation, everything I tell my kids about God and faithfulness and God and his love for his betrothed, about God and forgiveness, everything I tell them about that will be filtered first through what they see in me, in my life. They might be able to overcome that, but it will all be viewed through my own promises and faithfulness to those promises in my own marriage. So as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 9, Paul said, my aim is to please God. I would tell you that's exactly what our aim needs to be in marriage. That's a principle we need to take with us. As in all things, Paul says, my aim is to please God. Well, for us this week, may we think in terms of my marriage is to please God so that somebody, because believe me, it happens. I stand before you today as a child of God because of a family that was showing what it's like to portray the marriage of God and his people. Make sure you're shining forth in holiness. Happiness will come. Shine forth in holiness. Thank you so much for your attention this morning. I believe we're going to have a prayer here in just a second, but then right after that prayer, I think we are dismissed, and that's correct, right? Dismissed so the kids can go back to their classes, gives them about 10 minutes for the teachers to get back there and get prepped, and then the adults will stay in here and stay in for the second session this morning. So if you would bow with me for a word of prayer. Father, we're grateful for the day. We're grateful for marriage. We're grateful that you love us in that same relationship, and that you give us an opportunity to show through our relationships as husbands and wives, as mothers and fathers, show to the world what an awesome God you are. May they truly see holiness in our lives because we have made holiness the goal of our lives. May we strive to please you because we know if we please you, that you will take care of us as you have promised. We give you these thanks, offer this praise in Jesus' name. Amen.